Pull up any major European royal family tree from the 1700s. Follow the maternal lines, the women who married into these dynasties. Official history gives you minor nobility, distant cousins, princesses from German principalities, so small they barely appear on maps. But here's what happens when you try to trace these women's ancestry back just 2 or 3 generations. The documentation becomes remarkably sparse. Not incomplete, sparse. As if their histories began the exact moment they became useful to the narrative. And that's where the Tartarian question becomes impossible to ignore, because these families who obsessed over bloodline purity accepted brides whose ancestry couldn't be traced with certainty. Unless that ancestry was deliberately obscured, unless their real origins would have revealed something they needed to keep hidden, a connection to a place that's been systematically erased from history. Look at the Romanovs. The official history tells us they descended from the Rurik dynasty in a clean line of succession stretching back centuries. But the deeper you examine the genealogical records, the more you find transitions that seem managed, constructed. The documentation exists, certainly. Marriage certificates, birth records, court announcements. But what about the bloodline itself? There are whispers, academic whispers, the kind mentioned in footnotes and then never expanded upon. Whispers of Tatar ancestry in several major Russian noble families. Not Mongolian, Tatar. And not just rumors. Historical records document at least 156 noble families of Tatar or Eastern origin serving in the Russian court. The Yusupov family, one of the wealthiest in Russia, descended from Nogai Tatar ruler Yusuf Mirza. The Narishkin family, whose daughter Natalia became Peter the Great's mother, traced their lineage to Crimean Tatar nobility. The Meshersky princes descended from Meshera rulers who served under the Golden Horde. These aren't conspiracy theories. These are documented genealogies. Families who served at the highest levels of Russian power while maintaining their Tatar heritage. The word itself is a derivative, a linguistic cousin to a name we're not supposed to say out loud in historical circles. Tartary. Now look westward. The British royal family underwent a similar transformation. The House of Hanover, imported from German territories in 1714, were given the official explanation: Protestant succession, parliamentary approval, legitimate claim through distant Stuart ancestry. All documented, all proper. But here's what they don't emphasize. The Act of Settlement passed over approximately 50 Catholics with stronger hereditary claims to place a German prince on the British throne. 50 people, each with documented royal blood, each closer to the throne by traditional succession rules, all bypassed to install George of Hanover. But when you examine the German principalities these royals came from, you find something peculiar. The electorate of Hanover had only received electoral status in 1692, just 22 years before George became King of Britain. The confirmation by the imperial diet came even later. The dynasty had been elevated from a minor cadet branch of the House of Welf only in 1635. Primogeniture, the rule of eldest son inheritance, was only instituted in Hanover in 1683, just 31 years before they provided a British king. These weren't ancient, established royal houses, and they were recently elevated principalities with suspiciously convenient timing. Many of these small territories had themselves undergone recent dynastic changes. New families, new names, new crests, all within a generation or two of being called upon to provide British monarchs, as if they were created specifically to establish a false trail, to give these new royals a plausible but unverifiable origin story. The genealogical gaps aren't random. They appear at precisely the point where verification would reveal a common ancestor, a shared bloodline that wasn't supposed to exist on paper. Consider the marriages that consolidated power across Europe in the 1700s. We're told these unions were strategic, political, calculated to the finest degree. Yet the brides often appeared with minimal lineage documentation, married into the most documented families in human history, and then their origins became unquestioned fact. No one asked, no one verified. The silence was deafening. This raises a simple but critical question. If these royal houses were so obsessed with bloodline purity, why would they accept brides whose ancestry couldn't be traced with certainty? German house laws of the 18th century enforced strict requirements called Ebenbürtigkeit, equal birth. These laws demanded extensive genealogical proof. Marriages without proper documentation could be declared morganatic, meaning children couldn't inherit titles or succession rights. The Almanach de Gotha, published from 1763 onward, existed specifically to catalog noble genealogies with obsessive detail. So why didn't these same standards apply to the brides whose ancestry supposedly stretched back generations, yet somehow couldn't be documented beyond 2 or 3, unless that ancestry was deliberately obscured? Then I started looking at the buildings these families built, not the castles they inherited, the ones they constructed during their consolidation of power. In St. Petersburg, the Winter Palace, designed by Francesco Bartolomeo Rastrelli. Construction began 1754, completed 1762. In Vienna, the Schönbrunn Palace expansions. Johann Bernhard Fischer von Erlach started construction in 1696. Nicolaus Picassi completed major renovations in the 1740s, 1750s. In Madrid, the royal palace construction following the 1734 fire that conveniently destroyed the previous Habsburg residence, designed by Filippo Juvara and Giovanni Battista Sacchetti. Construction 1738, 1755. All of them share architectural elements that official history attributes to neoclassical revival or Baroque influence. But here's what troubles me. These buildings don't just share stylistic choices, they share specific technical features, construction methods, proportion systems, decorative mathematics. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision across thousands of miles, across cultures that supposedly had minimal contact, across royal houses that were allegedly rivals. Who were the architects? Different names in different countries, certainly. Rastrelli trained in Paris and Italy before coming to Russia. Fischer von Erlach studied in Rome. Juvara worked in Rome before being called to Spain. They all trained in Italy. They all studied the same classical principles. They all knew the same techniques. But when you try to trace where they learned to build at such massive scale with such uniformity, the trail goes cold. Not everywhere. Just at the critical points. Just where the knowledge would have been transmitted. Look at the interiors. The ceiling heights, the doorway proportions. The Great Gallery at Schönbrunn has ceilings reaching 10 meters high. The St. George Hall in the Winter Palace features columns 6 meters tall, supporting massive vaulted ceilings. These spaces follow specific ratios that create the impression of something grander than ordinary human scale, spaces that evoke power through their dimensions. But dimensions consistent with a shared architectural tradition. For context, the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles features 12-meter ceilings. The Pantheon in Rome, built in antiquity, has a 21-meter dome. These aren't anomalies. They're standard for Baroque palace architecture of the era. But the question isn't whether they're unusual for the time. The question is, why did 3 royal houses, allegedly rivals, all build to the exact same specifications during the exact same narrow window? Now here's what makes this impossible to dismiss as coincidence. All of these buildings share not just aesthetic choices, but specific technical features. The same load-bearing methods, the same approaches to material distribution, the same understanding of acoustics. These families weren't copying aesthetic trends. They were following inherited technical knowledge about large-scale construction that suggests a common source. And here's what the architectural record shows. These palaces were built during the exact same narrow window of time, 1738 to 1762, 24 years. The same period when Tartaria was disappearing from maps and new dynasties were consolidating power, as if they were building from templates that had existed previously. Templates from a time when Tartaria still appeared on the maps. Maps don't lie the way words can lie. They show what was known, what was believed, what existed in the minds of those who drew them. Pull up maps from the 1600s and 1700s. French maps, Dutch maps, British maps. Abraham Ortelius's Theatrum Orbis Terrarum from 1570 shows Tartaria. Willem Bleu's 1643 atlas shows Tartaria Saevae Magni Chami Imperium, Tartary, or the Empire of the Great Khan. Look at the vast interior labeled Tartary, or Grand Tartary, or Tartaria. Not a small region, not a footnote. An enormous territory stretching from the Caspian Sea to the Pacific Ocean, from Siberia to the frontiers of China. These weren't speculative maps, they were trade maps, military maps, maps drawn by cartographers who staked their reputations on accuracy because merchants and generals depended on that accuracy. And on many of these maps, you'll find something fascinating. Symbols indicating cities, trade routes, royal courts, multiple royal courts throughout Tartarian territory, as if this wasn't a collection of wandering tribes, but an organized society with governmental structures. The Encyclopaedia Britannica, 1771 edition, first published in Edinburgh between 1768 to 1771, has an entry for Tartary. It describes Tartary as divided into Russian Tartary, Chinese Tartary, and independent Tartary, not a mythical place, not a vague region, a recognized territory with subdivisions, just like Europe was divided into kingdoms, not a legend, not a myth, an actual recognized territory discussed with the same certainty as France or Spain. Then, over the course of the late 1700s and early 1800s, the label changes. Maps printed just 30 years apart show completely different territorial divisions. A British map from 1796 still shows Western Tartary, but by 1885, Colton's maps completely omit the term. Tartaria disappears from maps. Russian Empire now covers the territory. Not conquered and renamed, simply erased and replaced with new labels. The Library of Congress, in a 2025 blog post about historical cartography, explicitly states that the lack of colored regions or borders on Tartary maps reflects the reality that Tartaria was not a political designation. But here's what the official history can't explain. If Tartaria was just a vague geographical term, a catch-all for unknown regions, why did it have marked cities? Why did maps show internal borders, trade routes, royal courts? European cartographers were sophisticated enough to accurately map coastlines, trade routes, and territorial boundaries everywhere else, but suddenly they became vague and imprecise only when it came to the largest landmass on their maps. They drew borders, marked cities, indicated governmental centers, all for something that allegedly didn't exist as a cohesive entity. And here's the critical detail. The disappearance of Tartaria from maps coincides exactly with the consolidation of new royal dynasties in Europe. 1714, House of Hanover takes British throne. Tartaria still on maps. 1762, Catherine the Great takes Russian throne. Tartaria starting to disappear. 1800, Napoleon consolidates European power. Tartaria completely gone. The Russian expansion into Siberia and Central Asia occurred gradually from 1582 through 1885. That's 303 years of documented conquest. We should have transition documentation, treaties of dissolution, succession disputes, resistance movements, refugees, something. Instead, we get silence. And into that silence, we get new royal families with suspiciously recent genealogies, claiming territories that maps from a generation earlier labeled as Tartarian. The official explanation collapses here. We're expected to believe that the largest territorial entity on 1700s maps simply didn't exist, that hundreds of cartographers across multiple nations all documented something imaginary with perfect consistency. Or the alternative, that it did exist, that it was real, that it was systematically erased from history, and that the families who replaced it needed to obscure their connection to it. We live in an age of genetic testing. We can trace ancestry through DNA, confirming or refuting genealogical claims that once relied solely on documents. So here's a simple question. Why hasn't there been a comprehensive genetic study of European royal families mapping their actual ancestry? Not the claimed ancestry, the actual genetic heritage. Some studies exist, certainly, small ones, targeted ones. The Romanov remains were analyzed between 1994 and 2018. Results published in Nature Genetics and PNAS. They identified all 7 family members through DNA. Prince Philip provided DNA that confirmed mitochondrial matches through the maternal line. They even identified the specific mutation responsible for hemophilia in the family. Richard III's remains were analyzed in 2014-2015, published in Nature Communications. They achieved 99.99% identification probability through complete mitochondrial genome analysis. Habsburg inbreeding was studied from 2009-2019, analyzing over 3,000 individuals across 16 generations. The research correlated inbreeding coefficients with facial deformities and mortality rates, but never a complete mapping of the royal bloodlines using modern genetic techniques across all European houses. These families are obsessed with their heritage, with proving their legitimacy, with documenting their divine right to rule. So why wouldn't they embrace genetic testing that could definitively prove their claimed bloodlines, unless there's something they don't want found? Consider what DNA testing has revealed about ancient populations. We now know that groups we thought were isolated and pure were actually mixed, showing genetic markers from continents away. We know that pure bloodlines are a myth, that humanity is a tapestry of mixing and migration. So what would a comprehensive genetic study of European royalty show? The genetic question isn't just about DNA, it's about why they won't let us answer it comprehensively. In 1995, Queen Elizabeth II agreed to deny requests for DNA testing of the princes in the Tower remains at Westminster Abbey. The stated reason was concern about setting a precedent. But Prince Philip had already provided DNA for the Romanov identification. Living Bourbon descendants participated in authentication studies. Various relatives of historical royals donated samples. So it's not a blanket refusal, it's selective. Specific cases where testing is denied while others are permitted. Why royal families who claim unbroken bloodlines going back centuries refuse to provide genetic proof in certain cases? Because that proof might show they're not separate dynasties at all. They're branches of a single ancestral tree, a tree that grows from soil labeled Tartaria on every honest map from the 1700s. Royal families married across borders constantly during the 1700s and 1800s. We have documented accounts of princesses arriving in new kingdoms unable to speak the local language, requiring years to learn. Yet we also have accounts of these same families conducting private correspondence, understanding each other, perfectly when it mattered for political negotiations. What language were they using in these private contexts? The official answer is Latin or French, the diplomatic languages of Europe. But there are tantalizing references in old documents to other languages being used in certain royal contexts. Languages described as ancient or traditional but never specified. What if there was a lingua franca among these families that wasn't French or Latin? A language from their actual common ancestry. A language that would have revealed too much if used publicly. I'm not claiming I know what language that was. I'm asking why there's so much deliberate vagueness around linguistic practices in royal households during precisely the period when their genealogies become most important to establish. Look at royal heraldry, the symbols these families chose to represent themselves. The double-headed eagle appears in the Holy Roman Empire, the Russian Empire, the Byzantine Empire, several Balkan nations, and various German principalities. We're told this is because they're all claiming descent from Rome or Byzantium. The Byzantine Empire used it from the 10th century through its fall in 1453. Associated with the Palaiologos dynasty, it symbolized the unity of church and state. Russia adopted it in 1472 when Ivan III married Byzantine princess Sophia Palaiologina. He claimed Moscow as the Third Rome, inheritor of Byzantine authority. The Holy Roman Empire adopted it in the 15th century to distinguish imperial authority from mere kingship. But that's circular reasoning. Why would German principalities that had no connection to Rome or Byzantium adopt that specific symbol during the exact period when Tartaria was disappearing from maps? Unless it wasn't a Roman symbol, unless it was a Tartarian symbol, a marker of shared ancestry that they kept while changing everything else. The oldest origins of the double-headed eagle trace back to Bronze Age Mesopotamia. Babylonian seal impressions show it. Hittite royal insignia featured it. The symbol predates all European use by millennia. The pattern is everywhere once you see it. The genealogical gaps appearing at the same time. The identical architecture rising simultaneously. The maps being redrawn. The genetic evidence being withheld selectively. And the most troubling part? The fires. Count how many royal archives burned between 1700 and 1850. Count how many convenient fires destroyed records at exactly the moment those records would have documented the transition. The Royal Palace in Madrid, 1734. Christmas Eve, December 24th, 1734. The fire burned for 4 days, approximately 500 paintings destroyed, some state documents lost, though about 200 artworks were saved by being cut from frames. But here's what matters. All Habsburg family records, centuries of documentation about who these families really were, where they really came from, destroyed in a single night. The Library of Congress, 1814. August 24th, 1814, British troops burned approximately 3,000 volumes during the War of 1812. Early American genealogical records, colonial documentation, gone. Though staff evacuated some materials beforehand, the Constitution, Declaration of Independence, and Bill of Rights were saved by State Department clerks. Thomas Jefferson later sold his 687-volume personal library as replacement. But what records weren't saved? What connections between American colonial families and European aristocracy burned that night? The Hanover State Archives. Multiple fires over decades, most records lost. German church archives in Hanover lost 2/3 of materials in October 1943 World War II bombing. Hanover County, Virginia, lost almost all court records in the April 3rd, 1865. Richmond fire during the Civil War. 2 different Hanovers, 2 different fires, both destroying genealogical records. And these are just the famous ones. Dig deeper and you'll find dozens of smaller but critical fires that destroyed specific genealogical records, land registries, and historical documents during this transformative period. Some fires are inevitable across centuries. Buildings were made of wood and lit by open flames. Accidents happened. But the deeper you look, the more you find fires occurring at suspiciously convenient moments, right before genealogical claims would need verification, right after territorial transitions, right when old records would contradict new official narratives. Not everywhere, just at the critical points, just where the knowledge would have been transmitted. But some evidence survived, in scattered documents, in the architectural record they couldn't fully erase, in maps that predate the revision. Here's what the evidence suggests. In the 1600s, there was a vast organized territory across Central Asia called Tartaria. It had cities, trade networks, governmental structures, an advanced architectural tradition. By the late 1700s, this territory was fragmenting. Whether through internal collapse, external conquest, or some catastrophic event, the unified structure was breaking apart. European powers moved in, but they weren't conquering a primitive wilderness. They were inheriting an advanced civilization. And the families who took control were connected to the previous ruling class. That's why the genealogies don't trace back cleanly. That's why women with no documented ancestry suddenly became empresses. That's why German principalities appeared out of nowhere with full royal credentials. They were descendants of Tartarian aristocracy, but they couldn't admit that. They needed to claim they were conquering or civilizing these territories, not inheriting them from their relatives. So they rewrote the genealogies, backdated their dynasties, claimed legitimacy through fabricated European bloodlines, built in their traditional architectural style while calling it neoclassical revival. And they systematically erased Tartaria from the maps, from the encyclopedias, from acceptable historical discourse. But they kept the architectural knowledge, they kept the building techniques, and they kept the symbols, like the double-headed eagle, that marked them as descendants of something much older than they claimed. This wasn't a conspiracy in the modern sense. This was political necessity. If you're inheriting power from a fallen civilization, you can't admit you're inheriting it. You have to claim you're conquering it, civilizing it, bringing progress to backward regions. So the real Tartarian bloodline became German principalities, Russian empires, British monarchies, all pretending to be separate, all pretending to be rivals, all secretly descended from the same ancestral network they couldn't publicly acknowledge. The evidence is everywhere, in the architecture you walk past every day, in the maps historians pretend don't exist, in the genealogies that stop at precisely the point where truth would be revealed. The next time you see a European palace, look at the proportions, look at the doorways. Ask yourself who these spaces were really built for. When you hear about royal bloodlines, ask yourself why they won't submit to comprehensive genetic testing. What might they find that they don't want found? When you look at a modern map of Asia, ask yourself what was there before the current borders were drawn. What civilization covered millions of square miles before it was systematically erased? And ask yourself why we're not supposed to ask these questions. Why the genealogical records stop at precisely the point where they'd reveal something important. Why the maps change so completely in such a short time. Why the architecture speaks a language the official history refuses to translate. The Tartarian bloodline isn't a myth. It's hidden in plain sight, in the genes of every European royal family, in the buildings they constructed using knowledge they claimed not to have, in the symbols they kept while changing everything else. Maybe I'm seeing patterns in randomness. Maybe these anomalies are simply normal historical gaps. But what if they're not? What if there was a widespread bloodline that needed to be obscured? What if the royal families we're told are separate lineages are actually branches of a single ancestral tree? What if Tartaria wasn't a vague geographical term, but a civilization whose descendants still rule, but rule under new names, new genealogies, new official histories? The deeper I look, the more I realize what we call history might just be the story the victors agreed to tell. And somewhere in the fires, in the missing records, in the too convenient genealogies, there's another story. A story about who really built the world we inherited. A story we're not supposed to remember, but once you see it, you can't unsee it.